When President Harry S. Truman took the oath of office on April 12, 1945, he was stepping into one of the most uncertain moments in modern history. The Second World War was still raging in both Europe and the Pacific. Nazi Germany was collapsing, but Japan remained defiant. Inside the White House, chaos reigned. Franklin D. Roosevelt, the man who had led America through the Great Depression and most of the war, was gone. And his successor, Truman, was a man who had been deliberately kept in the dark. He had been vice president for just 82 days. During that time, FDR had barely spoken to him about the war effort, the Manhattan Project, or even the secret plans being discussed with Churchill and Stalin. So when Truman was called to the White House that April afternoon and told the president had died, he was walking into an office filled with secrets. Secrets that even he wasn't prepared to know. In the days that followed, Truman met with Roosevelt's advisors, read through the late president's classified papers, and began to uncover a side of Roosevelt that very few Americans had ever seen. Behind the warmth of his smile and the calm confidence of his speeches was a man who had quietly been redrawing the map of the world. A map that Truman would later describe as chilling. It wasn't just a political plan or a sketch of military zones. It was something else entirely. A vision of how the world might look after the war ended. One document in particular caught Truman's attention, a secret map, tucked inside a leather-bound folder marked Eyes Only. It was dated 1942, drawn in Roosevelt's own handwriting, and it showed the world divided into new zones of control. At first glance, it looked like a standard wartime reference, something used for planning. But the deeper Truman studied it, the more disturbed he became. The map didn't resemble the pre-war world. Entire nations had been wiped out, their borders merged into enormous regional unions. Europe was split into vast administrative blocks. Asia was divided not by country, but by what FDR called strategic spheres. And in the center of it all, highlighted in blue ink, was the United States, connected to both oceans, ringed with new territories and protectorates. To Truman, it looked like a blueprint for an entirely new world order. But why would Roosevelt draw something like this? And why had it been kept hidden from Congress, the public, and even his own vice president? As Truman flipped through the accompanying notes, the answer became more unsettling. FDR had been in secret talks with world leaders, discussing what would happen once the Axis powers fell, how borders would shift, who would rebuild Europe, who would control the Pacific, and how global resources would be divided. Roosevelt wasn't just thinking about ending a war, he was designing what came after it. The more Truman read, the more he realized this map wasn't about victory. It was about control and survival. Roosevelt had been planning not just for peace, but for an entirely new geopolitical structure that could prevent another world war, even if it meant reshaping entire nations. But there was something else that made Truman's stomach turn. The map included lines across Eastern Europe that matched, almost perfectly, the front lines Stalin's armies now occupied. It was as if FDR had already accepted Soviet influence over half the continent. Long before Yalta, long before the war had even ended. Had Roosevelt secretly agreed to let Stalin control Eastern Europe? Had he traded freedom for stability? Truman couldn't be sure, but the notes in the margins hinted at something dark. Phrases like zones of democratic guidance, economic supervision, and restricted sovereignty. Those weren't the words of liberation. They were the language of control. As night fell over the White House, Truman pushed the documents aside and stared at the map. To him, it was a symbol of the world's new reality, a world that would never truly return to peace. He knew he was inheriting more than a war. He was inheriting the machinery of a post-war empire, one that Roosevelt had already designed in secret. In the following days, as Truman met with Roosevelt's aides and generals, the pieces began to come together. He learned about the Manhattan Project, the plans for post-war Germany, and the quiet agreements Roosevelt had made with Churchill and Stalin. Every new detail made that map feel heavier, like a prophecy unfolding before his eyes. And as the weeks passed, Truman began to understand something chilling. Roosevelt hadn't just been planning for peace. He had been preparing for a new kind of war, one that would be fought not with bombs, but with borders, economies, and influence. A war that would last for decades. The Cold War hadn't started yet, but in that moment, Truman could already feel it forming, hidden beneath the lines of that secret map. He folded the paper carefully, placed it back in the folder, and locked it away. But the image of those red and blue lines, the divided continents, the erased nations, the spheres of control, would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had taken an oath to protect the United States. But now, he realized, he was standing on the edge of something far bigger. A world Roosevelt had tried to shape in silence, one that Truman was now expected to manage. And deep down, as he stared at the portrait of FDR on the wall, Truman couldn't shake one thought. Had Roosevelt seen something he hadn't? Or had he simply gone too far in trying to control a future no man could predict? The truth of that question, and what Truman would eventually do about it, would define the course of the next half-century. In the days that followed, President Truman began quietly asking questions, not to the press, not even to Congress, but to the men who had worked closest to Franklin Roosevelt. The map had shaken him, and he needed to know how real it was. Was this a concept, a personal idea, or an actual plan that the U.S. government was already following? One of his first conversations was with Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's trusted aide, who was still recovering from illness. Hopkins had been FDR's messenger to Churchill and Stalin. When Truman brought up the map, Hopkins didn't seem surprised. He hesitated, then told the new president that Roosevelt had been planning for a post-war world guided by stability, not borders. Truman pressed him. What did that mean? Hopkins reportedly replied, "The president believed nations are dangerous things, Harry. He wanted regions instead." Those words chilled Truman. Regions instead of nations. It sounded like Roosevelt had envisioned a world divided not by culture or history, but by control. Administrative zones managed by great powers. And yet, Hopkins insisted it wasn't tyranny. He said Roosevelt's goal had been to end the causes of war itself: nationalism, resource competition, and economic desperation. He believed the only way to prevent another world war was to create a system where no single nation could rise unchecked. To Roosevelt, it was a moral vision, a kind of managed peace. To Truman, it felt like something else entirely. Over the following weeks, Truman pored through more of Roosevelt's papers, finding references to a United Regions Plan, Zone 3 Pacific Administration, and Provisional European Authority. Each sounded more like an international government than a peace treaty. He realized that FDR's idea of world order had gone far beyond the United Nations. It was almost like a hidden map for global governance. And some of the notes went even deeper. There were hand-sketched outlines of Africa and Asia with penciled words like resource oversight and food balance. Zones. There were letters between FDR and British planners discussing the necessity of temporary occupation in certain colonies, not to free them, but to reorganize them under a new system of control. Truman started to see the pattern. Roosevelt had used the war as a way to reshape the global structure. The UN wasn't just meant to keep peace, it was meant to organize the world. But the map's most unsettling part wasn't its ambition. It was how much of it had already come true. By 1945, Eastern Europe really was under Soviet control, just as Roosevelt's Zone 2 had predicted. Germany was already being divided into sectors. Japan was being prepared for supervised reconstruction. Even the Middle East, marked on the map with oil regions connected by dotted lines, seemed to be unfolding exactly as FDR had outlined it. was as if the war hadn't just ended by chance. It had ended according to a script. Truman began to suspect that Roosevelt had struck understandings with both allies and enemies that no one else knew about. Some of the communications hinted at back-channel talks between Roosevelt and Stalin before Yalta, about spheres of influence, about future cooperation in economic administration. The tone was almost too trusting. Truman, who distrusted Stalin from the start, was furious. He reportedly slammed his fist on the desk and said he gave away half of Europe and called it peace. The truth was, Roosevelt had been trying to secure the world before it fell apart again. He believed that controlling chaos was the same as ensuring peace. But Truman, a man raised in rural Missouri, didn't see the world in those abstract terms. To him, freedom couldn't exist under the watch of a few powerful nations. Yet, as Truman looked around, he realized it was already too late. Roosevelt's map wasn't just a dream. It was already the blueprint of the post-war world. As the Potsdam Conference approached, Truman brought the map with him in a locked briefcase. He wanted to see how much of it Stalin and Churchill already knew. When the three leaders sat down to negotiate Germany's future, Truman noticed something unnerving. Stalin's advisors were using a map that looked almost identical to Roosevelt's. The same divisions, the same borders, even the same notes about industrial zones and security frontiers. That was when Truman understood. The secret map hadn't just been Roosevelt's idea. It had been shared. Perhaps not officially, but at least in spirit. Roosevelt had already promised the Soviets influence in Eastern Europe in exchange for help in defeating Hitler and later Japan. And now, with Roosevelt gone, Truman was left to honor a deal he hadn't made. He felt trapped between loyalty and conscience. On one hand, the late president had been a giant, the man who had led the nation through darkness. On the other, his private ambitions had tied America to a post-war order that Truman didn't trust. And then came the detail that made him sick. A note, written in Roosevelt's own hand, tucked into the map's folder. World peace requires guided democracy, not full independence. Only structure prevents chaos. Those words haunted Truman. Guided democracy. He read them over and over again. It sounded like the justification of a man who believed too deeply in his own power. A man convinced that the world needed his hand to survive. But the world that emerged from Roosevelt's vision was already crumbling. Stalin wasn't interested in guided democracy. He wanted dominance. Churchill wanted to preserve the British Empire. And the United States, under Truman, was left to hold the fragile balance. Truman locked the map away, refusing to destroy it, but never showing it publicly. According to accounts from his aides, he kept it in his personal papers, calling it a relic of dangerous dreams. Yet it influenced him deeply. It shaped how he approached the end of the war, the atomic bomb decision, and the birth of the Cold War. He saw the world not as Roosevelt had, united by control, but divided by fear. And that fear, he believed, was the only thing that could keep peace now. In private, he would tell his advisors, "The world doesn't need another map. It needs walls to keep the peace." And in the years that followed, those walls would become real. Iron, physical, and political. The Iron Curtain, the Berlin Wall, the partition lines that would slice through nations for generations, each one, in a strange way, an echo of that secret map that FDR had drawn in the dark. But what few people knew, what Truman never told the public, was that the map didn't stop at borders. It contained one final section, one that FDR had marked Confidential Strategic Zone 4, a section that would lead Truman to confront not just the future of the world, but the terrifying weapon that was about to define it. The folder marked Strategic Zone 4 was the one Truman feared the most. Unlike the other sections of the map, which dealt with borders, influence, and administration, this one was about power. Raw, unthinkable power. FDR had sketched a diagram of the Pacific, highlighting not only military bases, but the locations of the atomic research sites that Truman had only just learned existed. Truman had known about the Manhattan Project in broad strokes, but seeing Roosevelt's own notes connecting atomic capability to global strategy made his stomach churn. There were lines indicating priority targets and deployment zones, cities, industrial centers, regions critical to controlling not just armies, but populations. It was more than war planning. It was a blueprint for rewriting the world through fire. He stared at the map late into the night, imagining the consequences of unleashing such power. Millions of lives could vanish in an instant. Entire nations could be reshaped. And yet, Roosevelt had drawn it not as a warning but as a plan, one he expected to be enacted when the time came. The weight of responsibility pressed down on Truman. He realized that the moment he had been thrust into the presidency was far larger than he had imagined. FDR's hand had guided America into the future, but he had left the final choices for Truman, choices that could define humanity itself. The first decision came with Japan. Truman had already been briefed on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Military advisors argued that dropping the bomb would end the war swiftly and save countless American lives. But as Truman looked back at Roosevelt's map, he saw the other dimension. The bomb wasn't just a weapon against Japan. It was a message to the Soviets. It was the beginning of a new global order, the first move in the post-war game Roosevelt had envisioned. Truman paused, recalling the exact moment he first read the Strategic Zone 4 section. He remembered thinking, if we do this, we are no longer just fighting a war. We are shaping the world by fire. The map, the zones, the priority targets, all of it pointed to one conclusion. Roosevelt had intended to use the war not just to defeat enemies, but to create leverage for the peace he imagined. Yet the moral weight of that vision fell entirely on Truman. He had no FDR to guide him, no careful notes on diplomacy, no gentle voice to explain the reasoning behind these choices. He had to decide alone what America's hand in history would look like. On August 6, 1945, the first bomb fell on Hiroshima. 3 days later, Nagasaki was destroyed. The devastation was absolute, beyond imagination, and Truman felt the profound gravity of what he had unleashed. He knew he was executing a plan that Roosevelt had partly outlined, and partly hoped he would interpret wisely. The world that emerged afterward bore eerie resemblance to Roosevelt's secret map. Japan lay in ruins, occupied under a new system of governance. Europe was divided into spheres, with the Soviets firmly controlling the East and the West under U.S. influence. Colonial empires were weakened, new alliances were forming, and the atomic age had begun. And then the Cold War began to take shape. Stalin's expansion, Truman's containment strategy, the nuclear arms race, all of it traced back to that secret vision, that blueprint FDR had drawn quietly in a White House office years earlier. Yet Truman never revealed the map to the public. He knew the world wasn't ready to see the full scale of Roosevelt's vision, the plans that had guided war, peace, and diplomacy alike. Instead, he carried the knowledge privately, a silent weight shaping his decisions in Europe, Asia, and at the negotiating table with both allies and adversaries. Looking back, historians argue that Roosevelt's secret map was a turning point in history, a document that defined the trajectory of the modern world. It wasn't just a map, it was a warning, a plan, and a challenge all at once. And Truman, forced to confront it without guidance, became the man who had to navigate its consequences. A presidency defined by sudden decisions, global devastation, and the first glimmers of a divided world order. In his memoirs, Truman never mentioned the map directly, but those who studied his private papers noted the profound impact it had on his thinking. It explained his urgency in post-war planning, his insistence on strong alliances, and his cautious approach with Stalin. The map had haunted him, shaped him, and perhaps, in a way, defined the Cold War itself. As Truman aged and reflected on his presidency, he admitted to close advisers that the weight of history was heavier than he had ever imagined. FDR had left him a world in ruins, yes, but also a world already mapped. Every line a decision, every zone a responsibility. The map had made him sick, not only because of its scope, but because it forced him to realize that leadership in the atomic age meant living with impossible choices. And yet, despite the fear, the uncertainty, and the moral burden, Truman understood one truth. History doesn't wait for preparation. The choices of one man can ripple across continents, and the map, secret though it was proof that the fate of nations sometimes rests in the hands of those who inherit the unseen visions of the past. FDR had drawn the map in silence. Truman had carried it into the light, and in doing so, became a man who would forever bear the weight of a world Roosevelt had imagined, and a world Truman was now tasked with steering. The lines on that map, once invisible to the public eye, became the invisible threads of the 20th century, shaping wars, borders, alliances, and the delicate balance of power. And in the quiet moments, late at night in the Oval Office, Truman would look at the world and remember the map he never wanted to see, yet could never forget. It was a map that changed history, and it was a map that left a man sickened by the scale of human ambition, the cost of power, and the haunting reality that some secrets are too big for any one person to bear alone.